So just a short message before I begin this video. One of my anarchist friends, she's an admin at the Anarchist Memes Facebook page, is a trans woman, and she's currently working her way through transition. Now, a significant aspect of that process is hormone replacement therapy. But unfortunately she hasn't been able to get HRT for free on the NHS because transgender healthcare is an area which is severely lacking, and she's been told that it would be more than a year before her first appointment. Not being on HRT is unfortunately having some negative implications for her mental health. She's been having issues with depression and anxiety stemming from her gender dysphoria. She's been seeking counselling to help cope with it, although it's really not sufficient, and the antidepressants have some pretty serious side effects that she's been struggling with. She's found in the past that being on HRT has stopped these problems from arising in the first place. So now she's trying to buy the relevant medication online, however it's very expensive and she can't afford it on her own. So she set up a GoFundMe page and donations would go towards covering the cost of her HRT. If you're able to make a contribution, even if it's just a small one, it would be much appreciated. And no, this isn't like the amazing atheist milking his fans for money to buy a fancy new set of lighting or a flashy new camera. This is just so that she can have her basic necessities met, making daily life as a trans woman just a little bit easier. A friend in need's a friend indeed. Now with that aside, my friend Ryan recently made a video responding to a recent video of mine called Top 10 Capitalist Arguments. Before I address his points, I feel that it's necessary to clarify that this video was meant to be very, very condensed, and I ended up omitting a lot of what I could have included, so if it seems quite thin in comparison with my usual stuff, that's probably why. The video he made was responding to the issue of whether or not capitalism promotes innovation, and the first point he flagged up was my point regarding worker engagement, so we'll start with that.
A recent poll by Gallup found that only 13% of the 180 million employees in the 142 countries studied felt that they were engaged with the work they were doing.
Cameron's trying to debunk the idea that capitalism promotes innovation. However, his first argument is that there's some poll that suggests workers are not very engaged with their work. And it feels like a non sequitur. It might be the case that overall all workers are disengaged with their work, but that really doesn't have a lot to do with whether or not capitalism promotes innovation.
The reason I was referring to worker engagement is because creativity, that is to say the process of coming up with original ideas, requires a degree of engagement. If you're disengaged, you will not come up with creative ideas. And so in an innovative economy, you would expect to see a high level of engagement. It's not conclusive, but it's still a relevant indicator.
It could be the case that capitalism has an incentive structure that even though workers are very disengaged, they have the incentives to do innovation, to think of new ways to do things.
What you seem to be suggesting is that under capitalism, if you come up with a new idea for a widget and you innovate, it's possible for you to get into a position of economic power and hire a workforce to manufacture this new widget on a mass scale, so there's an incentive structure there. Hence, even though the majority might be disengaged from their work, it still promotes innovation. Now the problem I have with this argument is that what you call incentive structures, I call a class system. The maintenance of such class relations requires the creation of an obedient labour force, and this requirement of obedience suppresses the potential for creativity and innovation in individuals who otherwise might have come up with good ideas. Now, is it the case that mass production of new widgets requires these class relations? I don't think it is. There's no reason to believe that flat cooperative structures are somehow incapable of mass production. I mean, there are thousands that do it in Argentina every day, and the co-op sector in Argentina is continuing to grow. So although capitalism admittedly does promote a degree of innovation, it doesn't promote as much innovation as could be the case were it not for its class structure.
And what's worse is when you use these types of polls, there could be a lot of bias involved. Right? If you frame the question in such a way to make people feel like they should be disengaged with their work, well, what you're going to see, surprise, surprise, is workers feel that they're going to be disengaged. So I don't think it's a very good idea to use a poll in these types of situations.
That's a fair point. You're quite right to ask if the questions were leading, and I didn't actually check for this, which was careless of me, and I apologise. Nevertheless, let's have a look at the questions just now, and we'll see if they're leading. I know what is expected of me at work. I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work right. At work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. In the last 7 days, I've received recognition or praise for doing good work. My supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. There is someone at work who encourages my development. At work, my opinions seem to count. The mission or purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. My associates or fellow employees are committed to doing quality work. I have a best friend at work. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. This last year, I've had opportunities at work to learn and grow. The poll then goes on to explain that these items are arranged in order to progress from the basic needs of employees at the beginning towards the more advanced conditions for engagement at the end in items 11 and 12. Now, are the last items particularly leading? I don't think they are, but I apologise for the fact that I didn't look into this possibility. You then make a point about how living standards have improved overall, and there's been a very substantial increase in general economic prosperity over time. Now that's fair enough. However, it is important to recognise that this has not simply come about through the wonders of market forces. In fact, most wealthy countries probably wouldn't be where they are now had they not engaged in substantial violations of market principles through state funding of scientific research and development. Free markets very rarely make poor countries richer, and in fact, if markets are left to do their own thing, they're actually very dysfunctional, if not a recipe for disaster.
Psychological research suggests that when tasks demand basic thinking skills, financial incentives lead to poorer performance. More innovation occurs when people believe their activity has intrinsic value rather than merely being a means to make money. Greater autonomy for workers also helps to foster creativity, which is difficult if you're trying to arrange things so that profits flow up a hierarchy to a private owner.
Again, we have another argument based on evidence that really doesn't apply to the economy as a whole. Most jobs, especially in the future, will not be based upon basic thinking skills. As technology improves, we'll see more and more of these basic labor jobs be replaced by technology, by robots, and other various things.
Now this is just a bit of a misunderstanding. I was not referring to basic thinking skills as opposed to complex thinking skills. I was referring to basic thinking skills as opposed to purely mechanical skill, such as turning a crank, for example. And what the psychological studies found was that monetary rewards only work with purely mechanical skill, but as soon as the tasks demand a basic degree of thinking, then financial incentives actually led to poorer performance. I apologise for not making this clear. But if we accept what the psychological evidence shows, and if it is indeed the case that these menial mechanical tasks that incentivization is good for are now simply being automated, then it would seem to follow logically that incentivization is now becoming less relevant. With that being said, critical historian David Noble has some interesting things to say regarding automation. In fact, he argues that because it has to be done in the interest of the capitalists, there's actually a drive to keep work as dull and boring as possible. Nevertheless, I don't know much about it, so I won't comment, but the point is perhaps disputable regarding automation of menial work. Next point.
But let's say, just for argument, that this was the case, that workers would become more productive as they became more autonomous. The great thing about capitalism is if there is competition, all bosses, all firms will have the incentive to promote more autonomy for their workers if it does make them more productive, because it will cause bigger profits.
Well, it's not quite that simple, mainly for class reasons. Collectively, private owners all have a shared long-term interest in the maintenance of the capitalist system, and that includes the capitalist work structure. To introduce more autonomy for workers would be to undermine the validity of the capitalist work structure in the long term, and so private owners may refrain from doing so even if it would have made them more short-term profit. Business elites, particularly in America, because it's the most business-run society in the world, are highly class-conscious, and so individual private owners might sacrifice their own profit interests if it's in the interest of the capitalist class overall to do so. Noam Chomsky gives an interesting example of this. Back in 1977, US Steel, a major corporation, decided to close its operations in Youngstown, Ohio, which was a major steel town that had been built by steelworkers by the union. The Steelworkers Union offered to buy the plants and have them run by the workforce. It would have been more profitable for them, but I think a class interest militated against it. This happens frequently. A multinational frequently will refuse an offer by the workers to buy out something they want to close and prefer to take the loss of just destroying it to having the precedent of worker-owned enterprises. Capitalists may refrain from implementing these kinds of business practices even if they increase profits because they empower the working class too much, and granting workers more autonomy might be precisely such an example. Although perhaps a more important question is, why is it up to them? Does it bother anyone that we have an economy which is in principle autocratic?
Education under capitalism typically involves destroying creative and critical thought and training people for the mindless obedience of the workplace. Innovation, my arse.
I find this argument absolutely amazing. It makes me feel like Cameron is very out of touch with the current education system. Yes, especially in the United States, it might be true that public schooling is mostly meant to mold people into workers, and it might not promote creativity. But it's not usually the epic capitalists, the epic free market people that are against this, or that are completely for this, excuse me, right? It's not like the super libertarians are like, yeah, public school, we love that thing. No, they hate it. They want vouchers to create more private schools. They are like in complete agreement with you in this area.
This is another misunderstanding of my position. This is mixing up the format of education with the means by which such education is distributed. I was not criticising the idea that education ought to be provided for free as a public utility. Rather, I was criticising the format of education under capitalism as merely being a production line that trains people to be obedient workers. What the capitalists have a problem with is education being distributed as a public utility. They do not, however, have a problem with it being structured in such a way as to train an obedient workforce. That's an important distinction. But to conclude, I'd like to make a more general point. It may well be the case that capitalism does promote a degree of innovation. It may well be the case that it does increase living standards overall. However, as I said in my previous video, there have been horrific forms of tyranny which have led to increases in living standards, and nevertheless they are still utterly condemnable. As wealth inequality continues to rise, talk of democracy, meaningful democracy, becomes more and more of a facade. Corporations hire death squads to assassinate union leaders in Colombia for having the temerity to organize their workforce. Chinese workers commit suicide because the conditions of their labor degrade them to the status of machines, and management responds by installing nets beneath the windows. Capitalism may promote innovation, but I can assure you, further justification is required. Is it possible for us to promote innovation and increase living standards, but in a humane, non-exploitative, ecologically sustainable and egalitarian fashion? Yes, I think there is such a way, and it's called socialism. Anyways, I think that just about covers everything, so thank you very much for watching. Go and check out Ryan's channel if you're interested. He has some interesting content on American politics and current affairs, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.